In 2027, the Pentagon is actually planning to spend about $75 billion strictly on restocking missiles and deploying these unmanned drones.
Yeah, which is just a staggering amount of money for a single line item.
Right. I mean, that one line item just for missiles and drones is literally more than the entire gross domestic product of dozens of whole countries. But, well, what if I told you that every time one of those autonomous weapons rolls off the assembly line, the rent for your apartment or like the mortgage rate on your house might implicitly go up?
I mean, I get that it sounds like some wild conspiracy theory at first glance, but the mechanics behind it are actually firmly grounded in basic macroeconomics.
Totally.
Because when the government decides to inject that much capital into a specialized global supply chain, the ripple effects hit the domestic private sector incredibly hard.
Welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today, we are putting a massive stack of economic data under the microscope. We're specifically looking at a piece by Nyambi Emanuel, and it's titled Article 2, Government Spending, War Spending, and Today's Economic Crisis.
Right, and just for context, that piece is a crucial chapter in a much broader 10-part series called The 99% Perspective, a blueprint for economic justice.
Exactly. And our mission today for this deep dive is to explore the concept of opportunity cost, specifically as it relates to this giant tug-of-war between national defense spending and domestic spending.
Yeah, because the author basically attempts to connect these seemingly separate economic pain points, things like housing shortages, consumer debt, sticky inflation, and traces them all back to high-level federal policy choices.
And just to level set with you listening, because, obviously we are diving into national defense budgets and domestic social spending today, and those are massive political lightning rods.
Oh, absolutely.
So our goal today is definitely not to take a side, left or right, or tell you who to vote for or anything like that. We're not endorsing any specific political worldview here.
Right. We're strictly here to impartially report on the content.
Exactly. We're just looking at the author's math and their economic logic to see how this supposed opportunity cost actually impacts your wallet. Okay, let's unpack this. Because it turns out the most important question about government spending isn't just how much cash is flying out the door, but exactly who is standing underneath the money printer.
Yeah, that's the big question. And to figure out who is catching that money, we first have to establish the sheer scale of the macroeconomic reality the author lays out.
Right.
The starting point of this whole conversation is really the federal deficit. So according to the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, the nonpartisan agency that crunches numbers for Congress.
But folks who actually do the math.
Right. They project we are looking at a $1.9 trillion federal deficit in fiscal year 2026.
I literally can't even wrap my head around $1 trillion. If I spend $1 million a day since the year zero, I still wouldn't even hit $1 trillion. And they were talking about 1.9 of them just for the shortfall in a single year.
It is an unfathomable number, and the CBO actually projects that deficit will grow to $3.1 trillion by 2036.
Wow.
Yeah. To put that in perspective relative to the size of the entire U.S. economy, the deficit will rise from 5.8% of GDP to 6.7%. And just for context, the 50-year historical average is only 3.8%.
Okay, so we are way above average.
Exactly. We are basically operating in uncharted territory for a peacetime, non-pandemic economy.
So what exactly is driving that? Because I feel like the assumption is usually that the government is just spinning up massive new social programs or, building endless highways or something.
What's fascinating here is that a huge driver of this deficit isn't new, expansive programs at all. It's actually net interest costs.
Wait, really? Just the interest?
Just the interest.
Yeah.
The government is borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed in the past. Those interest payments are projected to grow from 3.3% of GDP to 4.6% by 2036.
So to put this in everyday terms for you listening, it is basically like a household using a huge chunk of their paycheck just to cover the minimum interest payment on maxed out credit cards.
That's a great way to look at it, yeah.
None of that money goes to fixing a leaking roof today. None of it buys groceries. It just goes entirely to past borrowing.
Which brings us to a really crucial mechanism the author highlights. It's a phenomenon the CBO calls the crowd-out effect.
Okay, what does that mean?
Basically, this massive federal borrowing actually crowds out private investment. It actively suppresses it.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of that. How does the government running a deficit physically stop a private business from, investing in itself?
So think about the available pool of capital in the financial system as a finite reservoir, right?
Okay.
When the government issues debt, so treasury bonds, to cover its deficit, it offers a virtually risk-free return. So investors, banks, and big funds just pour their money into those government bonds.
Right, because it's safe.
Exactly. And the CBO calculates that for every $1 increase in the federal deficit, private investment drops by about 33 cents.
Oh, wow. A whole third of it just vanishes from the private sector.
Right. And that is accounting for shifts in private savings and foreign investment, too. The government just absorbs the funds that could have otherwise been lent out to the private sector.
Okay, so to use like a plumbing metaphor, it's like water pressure in a neighborhood. There's only so much water in the main line.
Sure.
If the biggest mansion on the block turns on a massive industrial sprinkler system, which in this case is the government borrowing money to pay its deficit, the water pressure drops for everyone else.
Exactly, yeah.
The local businesses and the families down the street are just left with a trickle. They couldn't get the loans they need to build a factory or upgrade software or open a second storefront, even if they wanted to.
That is a perfect way to visualize the mechanism.
Yep.
The government is basically outcompeting the private sector for that exact same pool of money.
So if so much money is tied up in paying for the past, and private businesses are being starved of capital, we really have to ask, what is the government buying with the rest of its money that is so incredibly urgent?
Well, that leads us directly to the largest discretionary expense in the entire federal budget, which is national defense.
Right. And we all know the basic concept of opportunity cost. If I buy a fancy coffee, I obviously can't spend that exact same $5 on a muffin, but the author scales this up to a pretty terrifying level.
They really do.
At a federal level, it's not coffee and muffins. It is literally Tomahawk missiles versus affordable housing subsidies.
The scale of that opportunity cost is just staggering when you look at the numbers. The sources note that about 1/6 of all federal spending goes to national defense.
1/6. Wow.
Yeah. And globally, the text cites a Reuters report showing military spending hit $2.89 trillion in 2025.
That's almost $3 trillion globally.
Right, and that was the 11th consecutive annual increase. Plus, just 3 countries, the U.S., China, and Russia, accounted for 51% of that total.
And the Pentagon is actively asking for more. Like, the author references a Washington Post report detailing a $1.5 trillion defense budget request just for fiscal year 2027.
Yeah, it's massive.
And that includes the $75 billion strictly for unmanned weapon systems and missile restocking that I mentioned at the top of the show.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the author forces us to look at the direct dollar-for-dollar trade-offs here.
They put the national budget on a literal scale. On one side, you have these billions allocated for weapons procurement and defense contracts. And on the other side, the author lists what that exact same money could have purchased domestically. Things like affordable housing construction to alleviate rent pressure, or medical debt relief to stop families from declaring bankruptcy, or childcare support to keep parents in the workforce.
Okay, now wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second here. Because obviously the author isn't saying national security doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
If the government doesn't fund defense, the global shipping lanes that our economy relies on become totally unprotected.
That's a fair point, yeah.
Like, if a conflict breaks out and those shipping routes shut down, the cost to import basic goods skyrockets. And that just causes massive inflation anyway. Security is obviously necessary. How does the author square that?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author's argument actually anticipates that exact pushback.
Oh, they do.
Yeah. The text explicitly states that national security is, of course, necessary. A functioning economy requires secure borders and stable trade routes. The issue being raised isn't the mere existence of defense spending, it is the balance.
Okay, so it's about the proportion. It's about this aggressive acceleration of defense budgets while our domestic foundations are cracking.
Precisely. The author is asking, are these massive $1.5 trillion defense requests being weighed fairly against the financial security of working families?
Right.
The argument is that we are heavily over-indexing on military hardware, while the actual people who make up the economy are struggling with historic inflation, insane housing costs, and just massive debt burdens.
Which really begs the question of who is actually catching the money when the government drops $1.5 trillion on defense? We know the military employs a lot of people, but where does the bulk of that procurement money actually physically go?
Well, the source breaks this down by looking at the recipients of federal contracts. Defense spending heavily favors large, established institutions.
Okay, like who?
The capital flows primarily to massive defense contractors, multinational military suppliers, and notably the private equity firms that invest in them.
Okay, and just for anyone who hasn't been in the weeds of congressional terminology lately, the source mentions the White House's fiscal year 2026 skinny budget to sort of contrast this. What essentially is a skinny budget?
So a skinny budget is basically a stripped-down, bare-bones budget proposal. It outlines the administration's core priorities without all the massive granular detail of a typical federal budget.
Oh, I see.
And what the author highlights in this specific skinny budget is the really stark contrast in priorities. It proposed reducing non-defense discretionary spending by $163 billion.
Wait, $163 billion. That is a 23% cut from the previous year's level.
Yes. A 23% cut to the agencies that handle domestic programs, education, and infrastructure. And at the exact same time those domestic agencies were being slashed, the budget actively increased funding for defense and border priorities.
It sounds like a homeowner deciding to buy, I don't know, a state-of-the-art security system for the perimeter of the house. But to afford it, they literally have to cancel their health insurance and stop buying food for the people actually living inside the house.
That's a really stark way to put it. But yeah, it's the ultimate manifestation of opportunity cost.
But earlier you mentioned that war spending doesn't just pull money away from domestic programs, but that it actively makes the cost of living worse for the average person through inflation.
It does, yes.
I really want to dig into the mechanics there. How does a defense contractor building a missile make my groceries or my washing machine more expensive?
It happens through the supply chain and the specific nature of government contracts. So let's look at the how. Defense contractors often operate on what are called cost-plus contracts with the federal government.
Cost plus. What does that mean?
It means the government guarantees it will cover the contractor's cost of materials, plus a guaranteed percentage of profit on top of it.
Wait, so the contractor basically just has a blank check?
Essentially, yes. Building highly advanced unmanned systems and restocking missiles requires vast quantities of global resources. We're talking specialized metals like titanium and aluminum, massive amounts of fuel, rare earth minerals, and highly advanced microchips.
Right, all the expensive stuff.
Exactly. And because the defense contractor has that cost-plus guarantee from the government, they don't really care if the price of microchips or aluminum spikes. They will just pay whatever the premium is, knowing the government will fully reimburse them.
But a private car manufacturer or like an appliance company can't do that.
They absolutely cannot. The private sector is incredibly sensitive to price changes. So when the government creates this massive price-insensitive demand for raw materials, it just vacuums up the supply and drives the baseline price up for everyone else.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when you go to buy a car, the microchips and metals inside it cost more simply because defense contractors bought up the global supply at a premium.
That is a massive hidden tax on the listener. And it really compounds the pain of the budget cuts we just talked about. When the government cuts non-defense discretionary spending, things like affordable housing grants or Medicaid or small business loans, to fund those defense contracts, those domestic costs don't magically disappear.
No, not at all. The costs are simply shifted from the public ledger directly onto the private household.
Exactly.
If the federal government cuts rental assistance programs, the risk of eviction rises. So families then have to dip into high-interest credit cards just to make rent, taking on really toxic. If federal workforce retraining programs are cut, workers displaced by technology have fewer pathways to higher-paying jobs, which just traps them in lower wage brackets. The financial burden is transferred directly onto the shoulders of the consumer.
And this dynamic ties directly into the overarching theme of the author's whole 10-part series. The text actually makes a really fascinating historical parallel between the spending priorities we see today and the legacy of the Occupy Wall Street movement from over a decade ago.
Yeah, the author suggests that Occupy Wall Street wasn't just a protest against corporate greed, it was fundamentally a critique of macro-level public policy.
Right.
During the 2008 financial crisis, the core criticism was that public money, in the form of massive bank bailouts, was used to protect large, powerful financial institutions from the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, ordinary people absorbed all the damage through foreclosures and job losses.
And the author is arguing we are seeing the exact same dynamic play out today, just with a different set of institutions catching the bailouts, essentially.
Right. The source poses a highly critical question. Are public dollars being deployed to support broad public welfare? Or are they disproportionately benefiting powerful, entrenched industries like defense contractors?
Yeah.
When housing, healthcare, and education are systematically underfunded to feed a $1.5 trillion defense budget, it is the exact same core question Occupy asked. Is the government protecting the institutions or the 99%?
So what does this all mean for the people actually on the ground? Because we know an economic crisis doesn't hit everyone equally. The people absorbing the damage are rarely the ones sitting at the top of the economic ladder.
That disproportionate impact is a major focus of the text. These spending choices carry deeply unequal burdens, particularly for minority communities.
How so?
Well, the source points out that Black households and minority-owned businesses generally do not enter an economic crisis from the same starting point as their white counterparts.
Right, because of historical wealth inequality and the persistent racial wealth gap.
Exactly. They statistically enter a period of inflation or recession with less home equity, fewer liquid assets, and much thinner financial cushions.
Yeah, makes sense.
Furthermore, the author notes how budget cuts often target programs that are absolutely vital to these communities. For instance, rolling back DEI-related access.
Let's define how DEI functions in this specific economic context, actually, because it has become such a buzzword lately. What does the author mean by cutting DEI access?
Sure. So in the context of federal spending and contracting, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives often translate into specific government mandates. These mandates allocate a certain percentage of federal grants, small business loans, or municipal contracts specifically to minority-owned businesses.
Okay, so it is an economic ladder designed to help close that racial wealth gap.
Exactly.
So when the government decides to slash minority business support programs or, cut workforce retraining to fund a massive defense buildup, the impact falls disproportionately on these specific communities.
It does.
It literally pulls the ladder up behind the institutions that already have all the capital.
It strips away the exact support structures needed to weather an inflationary crisis. But to be fair to the text, the author is very careful to provide some balance here.
Right.
The argument is not a libertarian one. The text isn't arguing that all government spending is inherently bad or inherently inflationary.
Right. The source argues the exact opposite, actually. It posits that the right kind of government spending can act as a shock absorber for the economy. So it's not the spending itself that is the problem. It's the target of the spending.
Exactly. When public money is directed effectively, it reduces financial pressure and creates long-term stability. The author uses several examples of this helpful spending.
Like what?
Well, when federal funds are deployed to incentivize affordable housing construction, it increases the housing supply, which naturally reduces rent pressure and overcrowding.
And the author mentions SNAP too, right? The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which most people just know as food stamps.
Yes. SNAP is highlighted as a prime example of high-velocity economic spending.
High velocity, meaning it moves through the economy fast.
Yes. When the government provides food assistance, it completely frees up a low-income family's cash to pay for other essentials like utilities, transportation, or medical bills. Every dollar spent on SNAP generates more than $1 in economic activity simply because that money is immediately spent at local grocery stores, supporting local jobs.
The text also points heavily toward infrastructure and workforce training, which honestly feels incredibly relevant right now.
Oh, very much so. In a labor market where workers are facing sudden layoffs or being displaced by automation and AI, government spending on job retraining is just vital.
Yeah.
It allows a worker whose factory job was automated to transition into a growing field, like renewable energy installation or healthcare. That kind of spending builds long-term productivity and stabilizes entire communities, rather than just funneling cash to defense shareholders.
So, bringing this all together for you listening, the core message from this source is that government spending is never neutral. A national budget is, at its very heart, a moral and economic statement of priorities.
It really is.
The concept of opportunity cost proves that every single financial decision the government makes carries a direct trade-off. When trillions of dollars flow toward paying the interest on past debt and funding massive cost-plus defense contracts, a conscious, deliberate choice is being made to not fund the housing, healthcare, education, and infrastructure that the 99% rely on every single day.
This raises an important question, and it's really the central thesis of the author's work. In times of severe economic strain, the most vital metric to watch isn't just the overall size of the federal deficit.
Right.
It is who that deficit is fundamentally designed to protect. Are public dollars stabilizing households and building a foundation for the future, or are they shielding large institutions from the reality of the crisis?
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own, building on something we just touched on. The sources mentioned both AI job displacement in the domestic economy and the Pentagon's staggering $75 billion request for unmanned weapons systems.
Yeah, that's $75 billion.
Think about this. As automation and AI begin to replace traditional jobs in the regular economy and simultaneously replace traditional human roles in warfare, how will that shift the opportunity cost equation in the future? When robots are fighting the wars and algorithms are doing the jobs, who exactly is government spending designed to support?
It adds a completely new structural layer of complexity to the balance between defense and domestic needs. I mean, if the human element is removed from both sides of the equation, the economic purpose of the state has to be entirely reimagined.
It really does. Think back to that water pressure analogy. If the industrial sprinkler system is fully automated and it is running 24/7 just to water an empty field, who are we really securing while the local businesses run dry? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking closely at those budgets, keep exploring the hidden mechanisms of opportunity cost, and keep asking the hard questions about where your tax dollars are really going.